In the picturesque suburb of Rosewood Ridge, the Blake family dreams of a fresh start. Charles, a decorated firefighter, and Amara, an artist with a soul full of optimism, move into their charming new home with their 3 children, ready to build a brighter future. But their arrival is met with quiet hostility. A broken mailbox here, a lingering stare there, until the tension explodes into outright acts of hatred. As the Blakes stand firm against their neighbor Grant Morton's escalating campaign of harassment, they uncover a web of secrets woven deep into the fabric of the community. What begins as a fight for their home turns into a battle for justice, forcing Rosewood Ridge to confront the darkness that has lingered for decades. With the help of unexpected allies, including a brave young girl who risks everything to expose the truth, the Blakes discover that strength is not found in isolation but in unity. Yet as they close in on the truth, a shocking revelation about Grant's past threatens to upend everything they thought they knew. Can the Blakes protect their family and bring hope to a fractured community? Or will the roots of hatred prove too deep to overcome? The hum of the moving truck filled the air as it pulled to a stop in front of the 2-story house on Maple Lane. The Blake family spilled out, each person moving with the energy of excitement tinged with exhaustion. Amara Blake stretched her arms toward the sky, the late morning sun warming her deep brown skin. "Well," she said, hands on her hips, "here we are. Home sweet home." Charles Blake stepped out of the truck and took in the sight of their new house. It wasn't flashy, but it was theirs, a fresh start in a quiet suburb. His firefighter's shoulders squared as if claiming the space for his family. "It's a good house," he said with a reassuring nod. "Good neighborhood, good schools. We're going to be just fine." From the back seat of the truck, Malik, their 15-year-old son, climbed out with a groan, adjusting his earbuds. "Looks too quiet," he mumbled. "Like one of those places where nothing happens." "Exactly what we need," Charles replied, hefting a box marked kitchen. "Come on, Malik. Be helpful," Amara chimed in. "You're the muscle in the family, remember?" Malik rolled his eyes but grabbed a box. His younger siblings, Kelly and the 7-year-old twins Maya and Miles, popped out next, buzzing with excitement. "Can we pick our rooms now?" Kelly asked, already halfway up the driveway. "After everything's unpacked," Charles called after her. But as Amara turned toward the house, her eyes caught on a figure standing across the street. A wiry man with short silver hair leaned on the porch railing of the pristine brick colonial directly across from theirs. His piercing blue eyes locked onto the Blakes like a predator sizing up its prey. "Charles," Amara murmured, nudging her husband. "I see him," Charles replied evenly, giving the man a polite nod. The man didn't nod back. He just stood there, arms crossed, watching. The first few hours passed in a blur of unpacking, with the Blake house quickly descending into organized chaos. Boxes were stacked in the living room. The dining table was buried in bubble wrap, and the kids' laughter echoed down the halls as they debated who would get which bedroom. Around mid-afternoon, Amara stepped out to take a breather. She sat on the porch steps, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. The neighborhood was idyllic. Rows of neatly trimmed lawns, flower beds bursting with color, and a soft hum of distant lawnmowers. But it felt too perfect, like a photograph where something didn't quite fit. "Welcome to Rosewood Ridge," the voice startled her. A woman in her 50s with a careful smile and short, salt and pepper hair stood at the edge of the driveway. "Thank you," Amara said, standing and extending her hand. "I'm Amara Blake." "Mrs. Connor," the woman replied, shaking her hand briefly. "I'm the HOA president. Just wanted to stop by and say hello." "That's very kind," Amara said, though she caught the subtle tightness in Mrs. Connor's smile. "Well," Mrs. Connor continued, glancing toward the twins, who were chasing each other across the lawn, "we pride ourselves on keeping things orderly around here. I trust your family will feel right at home." "Of course," Amara replied, her tone warm but measured. As Mrs. Connor left, Malik appeared at the door. "She seemed friendly," he said, the sarcasm dripping from his voice. "Don't start, Malik," Amara warned. "No, seriously," he said, crossing his arms. "She was nice. Compared to the guy across the street." Amara followed Malik's gaze to see the man from earlier, still standing on his porch. This time, He wasn't alone. A small group of neighbors had joined him, whispering and throwing occasional glances at the Blake house. The next morning, Charles stepped outside to grab the newspaper and stopped in his tracks. Their mailbox lay on the ground, the post splintered and jagged. He crouched to examine it, noting fresh marks on the wood as if it had been struck deliberately. "Charles," Amara called from the doorway. He straightened, holding up the bent metal box. "Looks like someone took a swing at it." Amara's brows furrowed. "Kids?" "Maybe," Charles said, though his gaze drifted across the street. Sure enough, Grant Morton was on his porch again, arms crossed, watching. "Morning," Charles called, lifting a hand in acknowledgement. Grant didn't reply. Instead, he smirked faintly, then turned and went inside. Amara stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Do you think it was him?" Charles shook his head. "We can't jump to conclusions, but I'll fix it later." Later that day, Malik found his father with a hammer and nails, repairing the mailbox. "Why don't we just report it?" he asked, holding the post steady. "What good would that do?" Charles replied, "I don't know. Let people know we're not going to just roll over." Charles paused, looking at his son. "This isn't about rolling over. It's about picking battles. Fixing this," he said, hammering in the last nail, "is how we show them we're here to stay." In the early evening, Amara decided to take the twins for a walk. The neighborhood seemed quieter than usual, the air heavy with an unspoken tension. As they rounded the corner back toward their house, Amara froze. Scrawled across the sidewalk in front of their home were the words, "Go back," in bright red spray paint. "Mommy, what does that say?" Maya asked, tugging at her hand. "It's nothing, baby," Amara said quickly, ushering them inside. When Charles came home, she pulled him aside and showed him the graffiti. "This isn't kids being kids, Charles," she said, her voice trembling with anger. He sighed deeply, running a hand over his face. "I know. I'll take care of it." That night, Charles scrubbed the sidewalk clean under the cover of darkness, his jaw clenched against the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. From the corner of his eye, he saw the curtains move in Grant Morton's window. Dinner was interrupted by the sharp sound of shattering glass. Amara was the first to react, rushing to the kitchen where a jagged hole now marred the front window. A rock lay amidst the shards, tied with a scrap of paper. Charles arrived seconds later, carefully picking up the rock and untying the note. His expression darkened as he read it aloud. "Leave now." Kelly appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide. "Who did this?" "Go back to your room, Kelly," Charles said firmly. "But now," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Malik, however, lingered. "We need to call the cops," he said. Charles hesitated, but Amara nodded. "He's right. We have to report this." When the police arrived, their response was less than encouraging. The officer shrugged, jotting a few notes on his clipboard. "Could be some kids messing around. Not much we can do unless you've got witnesses." "We'll install cameras," Charles said tightly. "That might help," the officer said, handing over his card. "Call us if anything else happens." As the officer left, Malik turned to his father. "If this keeps up, we're going to need more than cameras." Charles didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the darkened street. Grant Morton's house loomed across the road, its porch light a dim beacon in the night. Charles adjusted his tie and stepped into the small, beige-walled community center. The air inside was cool, but the atmosphere was tense. A dozen or so neighbors sat in folding chairs, murmuring among themselves. At the front of the room stood Mrs. Connor, her expression strained as she shuffled through a stack of papers. "Thank you all for coming," she began, glancing at the clock. "Let's begin." Charles found a seat near the back, scanning the room for familiar faces. Near the front, Grant Morton sat with his arms crossed, his piercing blue eyes flicking toward Charles with thinly veiled disdain. Charles held his gaze for a moment before looking away. As the meeting progressed, Mrs. Connor covered mundane topics, street maintenance, trash collection, landscaping guidelines. When she opened the floor for concerns, Charles raised his hand. "Yes, Mr. Blake?" He stood, keeping his voice steady. "Last night, someone threw a rock through our front window with a threatening note. This isn't the first incident we've experienced since moving in, and I think it's something the neighborhood should address." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room, and all eyes turned toward Grant. He leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. "Do you have proof of who did it?" he asked, his tone sharp but casual. "No, I don't," Charles admitted. "But the hostility we've felt since moving in is clear. I'm hoping we can work together as a community to ensure everyone feels welcome here." Grant scoffed, loud enough for the room to hear. "Sounds like paranoia to me. Maybe you're reading too much into it." Charles's jaw tightened. "This isn't paranoia. It's harassment," Mrs. Connor interjected, her voice strained. "Let's keep this civil, please. Mr. Blake, we take these concerns seriously, but without evidence, there's little the HOA can do." Grant shot Charles a satisfied glance as the conversation moved on. Mrs. Connor caught Charles in the hallway after the meeting. "Mr. Blake," she said quietly, "stirring things up with accusations might make things worse. My advice? Keep your head down. These things have a way of resolving themselves." Charles clenched his fists but managed a curt nod. "Thank you for your advice," he said, though his tone made it clear he didn't mean it. Back at home, Malik was sitting at the dining table, scrolling through his phone when Charles walked in. His father's tense expression told him everything he needed to know. "Let me guess," Malik said. "The meeting was useless?" Charles sank into a chair with a sigh. "It was predictable. Figures," Malik muttered. He slid a small envelope across the table. "This was in the mailbox when I got home." Charles opened it, his brow furrowing as he read the single line of messy handwriting. "Ask about the land." "What does that mean?" Malik asked. "I don't know," Charles said, his mind racing. "But it's worth looking into." Amara entered the room, holding a mug of tea. "What's worth looking into?" Charles handed her the note. She frowned. "Land? Could it be about the property? Zoning?" "Could be," Charles said. "I'll check the records tomorrow." Malik leaned forward. "What if it's something Grant doesn't want us to know? Maybe he's got skeletons in his closet." Charles gave his son a faint smile. "You've been watching too many detective shows. Or maybe not enough," Malik quipped. Amara placed a reassuring hand on Charles's shoulder. "Whatever it is, we'll figure it out." The next morning, Charles pored over zoning maps and property records at the county office. Sure enough, there were discrepancies. The records showed an overlapping parcel of land between his property and Grant's, with conflicting ownership claims. When Charles returned home, Grant was waiting for him on the sidewalk, arms crossed. "Been busy, I see," Grant said, his smirk razor-sharp. "I'm just making sure everything's in order," Charles replied evenly. "Is that right?" Grant took a step closer, his voice lowering. "You're new here, so let me give you some advice. This is my neighborhood. People listen to me. Don't make waves unless you're prepared to deal with the consequences." Charles stood his ground. "I'm not here to make waves, Mr. Morton. I'm here to live my life. But if you're threatening me or my family, that's a line you don't want to cross." Grant chuckled, his tone dripping with condescension. "A word of advice. Know your place." Malik watched the exchange from the front porch, his phone held low, recording. When Grant walked away, Malik approached his father. "I got it all," Malik said. "Every word." Charles exhaled deeply, his frustration mounting. "Good. Keep that video safe." Amara was setting up her art supplies in the dining room when she heard a soft knock at the front door. She opened it to find a young girl with blonde hair and wide, nervous eyes standing on the porch. "Hi," the girl said. "I'm Lily. I live down the street." "Hello, Lily," Amara said with a warm smile. "What can I do for you?" Lily hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. "I just wanted to say, I like your paintings. I saw them through the window." Amara chuckled softly. "Thank you. Would you like to come in and see them?" Lily nodded eagerly. Once inside, she stood in awe of the unfinished canvases propped against the walls. "You're really good." "Thanks," Amara said, her tone soft. "Do you paint?" "Sometimes," Lily said, then lowered her voice. "I wanted to tell you something. My parents, they don't like Mr. Morton. They say he's dangerous." Amara's heart tightened. "Why do they think that?" Lily shrugged. I don't know, but my mom said not to make him mad. Amara knelt to Lily's level. Thank you for telling me. That was very brave. Lily offered a shy smile before running off. Amara closed the door and leaned against it, her mind racing. That night, Charles was locking up the house when he noticed something odd outside. The family's car, parked in the driveway, had all 4 tires slashed. Spray painted across the hood in large, red letters was a single word: leave. Amara, Charles called, his voice tight. She joined him at the window, her hand flying to her mouth when she saw the damage. Malik stormed into the room moments later. What now? He asked, his voice laced with anger. When he saw the car, his fists clenched. We need to call the cops. Charles nodded. We will. But this time, we'll have more than a report. He grabbed his phone, snapping pictures of the car from every angle. Amara did the same, her hands trembling slightly. When the police arrived, the officer seemed more concerned than before. This is serious, he admitted. It's escalating. I'll file the report, but you might want to think about security cameras. We've already started, Charles said. As the officer drove away, Charles turned to his family. This isn't just about us anymore, he said. We're not leaving, but we need to be smart. Everyone stays alert. We watch each other's backs. Malik crossed his arms. And what if it gets worse? Charles met his son's gaze. Then we fight back. With the truth, the house was quieter than usual. Charles had gone to work, and Amara was in her makeshift art studio, pouring her thoughts into brushstrokes. Malik sat at the dining table, his laptop open and headphones in place as he scrolled through the footage he'd recorded over the past few days. Gotcha, he muttered to himself, pausing a clip. The video showed Grant Morton standing on his porch late at night, speaking with 2 other neighbors. Their voices were muffled, but Malik recognized one of the men as Mr. Callahan, who lived 2 doors down. He quickly clipped the footage, enhancing the audio where he could. The words were faint but chilling. We can't let them think they belong here. Mom, Malik called, pulling his headphones off. Amara appeared, a paintbrush still in her hand. What's wrong? Listen to this, Malik said, playing the clip. Amara frowned as the words replayed. They're plotting against us. Exactly, Malik said, his voice tinged with anger. We need to show this to Dad. It's proof. Amara nodded, but her face betrayed her unease. Good work, Malik. But don't let this consume you, okay? Your father and I will handle it. Malik leaned back, folding his arms. Yeah, well, someone needs to do something. I'm sick of waiting for them to escalate. Her hand brushed his shoulder. We'll get through this. Together. That afternoon, there was another knock at the door. This time, when Amara opened it, Lily wasn't alone. A second girl, slightly older with a tangled mess of brown hair, stood next to her. This is my friend Emma, Lily said, her voice barely above a whisper. Emma glanced over her shoulder before thrusting a crumpled piece of paper into Amara's hand. I heard my dad talking to Mr. Morton, she blurted. I wrote it down. Amara unfolded the note and read it silently. We need to keep the pressure on. If they don't leave soon, we'll make sure they regret staying. Her stomach twisted. Emma, this is very brave of you, she said carefully. But does your dad know you're here? Emma shook her head. No, and please don't tell him. If he finds out, her voice trailed off, her eyes wide with fear. You're safe here, Amara said softly. Thank you for trusting me. The girls left quickly, disappearing down the street. Amara stood in the doorway for a long moment, staring at the note. When she stepped back inside, Malik was waiting. What now? He asked. Amara sighed. We show your father. He'll know what to do. That evening, after Charles came home and read Emma's note, he shook his head in frustration. This is getting out of control, he said. I need to talk to someone who can confirm this. You think anyone will? Amara asked, skepticism lacing her voice. There's one person who might, Charles said. Mrs. Connor. The next morning, Charles walked over to Mrs. Connor's house. She answered the door quickly, her expression guarded. Mr. Blake, she said. What brings you by? Charles held up the note Emma had written. I think you already know. Mrs. Connor's eyes flicked to the paper, then back to him. Come inside, she said reluctantly. Once seated in her pristine living room, Charles laid out everything they'd gathered: the footage, the note, the graffiti. Mrs. Connor listened silently, her face growing paler with each word. Mr. Morton has been doing this for years, she admitted finally. He's influential in the HOA. People are afraid to cross him. Why? Charles asked. Mrs. Connor hesitated, then sighed. He has a way of finding people's weak spots. Financial troubles, personal secrets. He uses them as leverage. So, what do we do? She met his gaze. You gather proof. More than what you have. Enough to force the HOA to act. But be careful. Grant doesn't lose easily. Later that day, Charles was in the backyard fixing a loose fence post when he heard Amara's sharp intake of breath. Charles, she called. He rushed around to the side of the house and froze. Sprayed in bold, red letters across the siding were the words, "You've been warned." Malik appeared at the back door, his phone already in hand. "I'm recording," he said flatly. Charles clenched his fists, then exhaled slowly. "Take pictures," he instructed. "Document everything." As they worked, Amara pulled Charles aside. "This is escalating," she said, her voice trembling. "What if it gets worse?" "It won't," Charles said, his tone resolute. "Not if we fight back the right way." That evening, Malik sat at the dining table, his laptop open. Amara worked quietly on a painting in the corner, while Charles reviewed the photos and notes they'd compiled. "I'm posting it," Malik said suddenly. Charles looked up. "Posting what?" "The video of Grant and the graffiti," Malik replied. "People need to see what's happening." Charles hesitated. "Malik, once it's out there, we can't take it back. Are you sure you're ready for that?" Malik's jaw tightened. "I'm ready. They need to know." Charles nodded slowly. "Do it." The next morning, the family woke to an unexpected storm. Not from the sky, but from the internet. The video Malik posted had gone viral, drawing hundreds of comments and shares. Most people were supportive, but a few messages were hateful, accusing the Blakes of stirring trouble. As Amara read through the comments, her phone buzzed. It was a reporter asking for an interview. "What should we do?" she asked Charles. He thought for a moment. "We tell our story," he said finally, "but we do it carefully. No leaks until we're ready." Amara placed a hand on his arm. "We'll get through this," she said, "but it's only going to get harder before it gets better." Charles nodded, his gaze firm. "Let them come. We're ready." Charles sat at the kitchen table, the morning sunlight streaming through the covered front window. A stack of files sat before him, each one meticulously organized with photos, notes, and videos. Amara placed a steaming cup of coffee beside him and sat down. "You're meeting with them today?" she asked softly. Charles nodded. "Civil Rights Advocacy Network. They've been watching the video Malik posted. They think they can help." Amara leaned forward, her hand resting on his. "Do you trust them?" "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but we're running out of options." Malik walked in, holding his phone. "People are still commenting. Most are on our side. But," he hesitated, showing his father the screen. A message read, "You're not welcome here. Leave before things get worse." Amara's lips tightened. "We need allies, Charles. People who can do more than just watch." Charles stood, determination hardening his expression. "That's exactly why I'm going. This stops today." Amara was tidying up when she heard a soft knock at the door. She opened it cautiously, expecting another reporter or neighbor. Instead, Lily and Emma stood on the porch. "Can we come in?" Lily asked, glancing nervously over her shoulder. Amara nodded, ushering them inside. "What's going on?" Emma held out another crumpled piece of paper. "I heard Mr. Morton talking to my dad again," she whispered. "He said something about zoning maps and how he'd fix things to make sure he wins." Amara unfolded the note and read the details Emma had jotted down. It was vague but incriminating. "You're sure you heard this?" she asked. Emma nodded vigorously. "I'm sure." Lily added, "They're scared of him. That's why no one talks." Amara knelt down, meeting their eyes. "You're both so brave for sharing this. I promise we'll do something about it." Lily's gaze flickered toward one of Amara's unfinished canvases. "Can I tell you something?" she asked. "Of course." I wish I could be like you. You're not afraid to fight back. Amara's chest tightened, tears stinging her eyes. It's not that I'm not afraid, she said softly. It's that I refuse to let the fear win. The girls smiled faintly before leaving, and Amara sat down, gripping the note. This was something Charles needed to see immediately. Charles returned that evening, his face a mixture of exhaustion and hope. How did it go? Amara asked as he sat down. They're on board, he said. They're connecting us with a journalist and offering legal advice. They think we can make a strong case. Malik, who had been eavesdropping from the hallway, stepped into the room. What about the lawyer? Did they say anything about that? Charles nodded. They recommended someone who specializes in cases like this. I've already made an appointment. Amara handed him the note Emma had given her. And there's more. Emma overheard Grant talking about zoning maps and manipulating records. Charles's eyes narrowed as he read. This changes everything. If we can prove he's tampered with zoning laws, it'll dismantle his whole position. Malik grinned. Looks like we're finally ahead. Not so fast, Charles cautioned. Grant's not the type to back down easily. If anything, he's going to double down. Amara sighed, looking at her husband. What do we do now? Charles's voice was firm. We prepare for the next move. Together. The next day, the Blakes were jolted by the sound of shouting outside. Charles peered through the window and froze. A group of neighbors, led by Grant Morton, stood on the lawn, waving signs and shouting. This neighborhood isn't for everyone. Grant's voice boomed through a megaphone. We've got standards to uphold. Charles's fist clenched. Malik, get the camera. Amara, stay inside with the kids. No, Amara said, stepping forward. We face this together. The family stepped onto the porch, Charles leading the way. The crowd grew louder, their shouts blending into a hateful cacophony. Enough. Charles's voice cut through the noise. The mob quieted slightly as he stepped forward. This is harassment, and it stops now. Grant smirked. We're just defending our community, Blake. This is my community too, Charles said firmly. And I'm not going anywhere. Your threats don't scare us. Grant's expression faltered for a moment before he recovered. We'll see about that. Malik raised his phone, recording every word. The mob began to disperse, some neighbors looking ashamed, others defiant. Grant lingered, his eyes locked on Charles in a silent challenge, before turning and walking away. Back inside, Charles turned to Malik. Did you get it all? Every second, Malik replied, his voice steady. Good, Charles said. We'll make sure people see the truth. The next morning, Malik's video of the confrontation was uploaded to social media. Within hours, it gained traction, with comments pouring in from people offering support and condemning the mob's actions. A reporter called, requesting an interview. Charles hesitated but ultimately agreed, knowing it was time to share their story. The interview aired that evening, featuring the footage Malik had captured and the Blakes' testimony about the harassment they'd faced. The response was overwhelming. Messages of support flooded their inbox, and several neighbors quietly reached out, offering to testify against Grant. That night, as the family sat together, there was a knock at the door. Charles opened it to find Mrs. Connor standing there, her face pale. Mr. Blake, she said quietly, I want to help. Grant's controlled this neighborhood for too long. If you need testimony, I'll give it. Charles nodded, gratitude evident in his eyes. Thank you. We'll need all the help we can get. As Mrs. Connor left, Amara placed a hand on Charles's arm. We're turning the tide, she said softly. Charles looked around at his family, his voice resolute. This is just the beginning. We're not just fighting for us. We're fighting for what's right. Charles sat in the living room with the family's new lawyer, Margaret Reyes, a sharp-eyed woman with a calm demeanor. Spread out on the coffee table were files, photos, notes, and Malik's videos. You've gathered a lot, Margaret said, flipping through the pages. This is strong evidence of harassment and intimidation. But to solidify our case, we need more. Specifically, something that directly links Grant Morton to these actions. Charles leaned back, frustration etched on his face. We have the note Emma gave us, the vandalism, the footage of him rallying people against us. What more do we need? Margaret placed a hand on the files. I don't doubt you've been targeted, but we're dealing with legal standards. A smoking gun, like proof of him coordinating these attacks, will make the difference. Malik, sitting on the edge of the couch, spoke up. Then we'll get it. He's too cocky not to slip up. Margaret smiled faintly. That's the spirit. I'll start filing motions for a formal investigation. In the meantime, stay vigilant. As she left, Charles turned to Malik. She's right. We need more. Think you're up for it? Malik grinned. I've got this. The next morning, Malik's latest video, a compilation of footage showing Grant's escalating threats, had taken the internet by storm. Comments flooded in, most of them supportive, but a few were chilling. Dad, look at this, Malik said, holding his phone out. The screen displayed a comment, "You're not safe. Leave now." Charles's expression darkened as he read it. They're getting desperate. Amara sat at the table, her arms folded. Desperate people are dangerous. What if this turns violent? Charles hesitated before replying. We won't let it come to that. The police have been patrolling more since the last incident, and Margaret's working on the legal side. Amara's lips tightened. The police barely showed interest before. Why would they step in now? Because they're being watched, Charles said. This case is in the public eye now. They can't ignore us anymore. Malik smirked. Feels good to have the upper hand for once. But Amara wasn't convinced. Just promise me we'll be careful. I promise, Charles said, his voice firm. We're not letting them scare us. That afternoon, the family was startled by the rumble of machinery outside. Charles rushed to the window and saw a small construction crew on their lawn, led by none other than Grant Morton. What now? Amara muttered, following him. Charles stepped onto the porch, his voice booming. What's going on here? Grant smirked, gesturing to the workers. Fixing a mistake. Your house is sitting on land that doesn't belong to you. That's a lie, and you know it. Charles snapped, stepping off the porch. Prove it, Grant said, his tone mocking. Malik appeared at the door, his phone raised. Already on it. The workers hesitated, glancing nervously between Charles and Grant. You're trespassing, Charles said, pointing at them. Leave now, or I'll call the police. Grant's smirk faltered. Go ahead, he said, though his voice had lost some of its bravado. Before Charles could respond, the sound of sirens cut through the tension. 2 police cars pulled up, and officers stepped out. Is there a problem here? One of them asked. Charles gestured toward Grant and the crew. They're on my property without permission. Grant raised his hands in mock surrender. Just a misunderstanding, officer. The lead officer glanced at the workers, then at the equipment. Pack it up, he said. Now. Grant glared at Charles as the crew began dismantling their setup. This isn't over, he muttered before stalking away. That night, the Blakes were jolted awake by the acrid smell of smoke. Charles bolted out of bed, his firefighter instincts kicking in. Stay here, he shouted to Amara as he ran downstairs. Flames licked the edge of the backyard, consuming the fence and creeping toward the house. Charles grabbed the fire extinguisher from the kitchen and rushed outside, dousing the flames with practiced precision. Malik appeared at the door, phone in hand. Dad, what happened? Someone said it, Charles said grimly, gesturing toward a half-burned gasoline can nearby. Amara joined them, her hand covering her mouth. Oh my God. The kids, are they safe? They're fine, Charles assured her. But this is it. We're not waiting anymore. The police arrived quickly, their expressions grim as they surveyed the scene. Charles showed them the gasoline can and pointed toward the cameras installed on the side of the house. If they caught anything, we'll know who did this, he said. The officer nodded. We'll review the footage. In the meantime, we're opening an arson investigation. As the police drove away, Charles turned to his family. This ends now. No more waiting. We're fighting back with everything we've got. The following days were a flurry of activity. Margaret worked tirelessly, gathering every piece of evidence the Blakes had compiled. The footage from the cameras had caught a shadowy figure fleeing the scene of the fire, and while it wasn't definitive, it added weight to their case. As they prepared for the upcoming court date, the family gathered in the living room. Margaret spread out the case files on the coffee table, walking them through each piece of evidence. This is strong, she said, tapping the file. "We have Emma's note, the video of Grant's threats, the vandalism, and now the arson. Combined, it's enough to file charges for harassment, property damage, and trespassing." "And the zoning manipulation?" Charles asked. "We've submitted a formal request for an investigation," Margaret said. "If they find proof, it'll undermine everything Grant's built." Amara looked at Charles, her voice soft but steady. "Do you think this will be enough?" Charles placed a hand on hers. "It has to be." Malik grinned. "We're going to win." Margaret nodded. "With this evidence, you're in a strong position. But be ready. Grant won't go down without a fight." Charles's expression hardened. "We're ready." The courtroom was quiet except for the rustle of papers and the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Charles sat beside Margaret at the plaintiff's table, his shoulders squared but his jaw tight. Amara sat behind him, clutching Malik's hand. Across the room, Grant Morton lounged in his seat, his smirk still firmly in place. "All rise," the bailiff called. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. Margaret opened by presenting the Blake's case, the vandalism, the threats, and the fire. Each piece of evidence was laid out meticulously, and Malik's videos played on a large screen, showing the neighborhood harassment and Grant's thinly veiled threats. "This is not an isolated incident," Margaret said firmly. "This is a coordinated campaign of harassment led by the defendant, Grant Morton, to intimidate and terrorize the Blake family into leaving their home." Grant's lawyer countered with arguments of misunderstanding and lack of direct evidence tying Grant to the fire or other incidents. But the tide shifted when Margaret introduced Emma's note. "Your Honor," Margaret said, holding up the crumpled paper, "this note, written by a young girl afraid of Mr. Morton, documents his threats to coerce neighbors into participating in his campaign against the Blakes." The courtroom fell silent as the note was read aloud. For the first time, Grant's smirk wavered. After the court recessed for the day, the Blakes stepped outside, where a small crowd had gathered. Reporters and onlookers waited, their cameras flashing. "Mr. Blake, do you think the court will rule in your favor?" a reporter asked, shoving a microphone toward Charles. "I believe in justice," Charles said simply, "and I believe the truth will come out." Nearby, several neighbors stood in small clusters. Some avoided the Blake's eyes, while others nodded in quiet support. Mrs. Connor approached hesitantly, wringing her hands. "Mr. Blake," she said, her voice trembling, "I wanted to apologize for not stepping in sooner, for being complicit. Grant, he's had this neighborhood under his thumb for years." Charles studied her for a moment before nodding. "Thank you for saying that. But it's not about apologies. It's about change." Mrs. Connor nodded, tears in her eyes. "We'll do better. I promise." The following week, the courtroom was packed as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict. Charles held Amara's hand tightly, his other hand resting on Malik's shoulder. After reviewing the evidence, the judge began. "This court finds the defendant, Grant Morton, guilty of harassment and property damage. Further investigations into zoning violations and arson are ongoing." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Grant's face darkened as the judge continued, outlining the fines and community service he would face, along with a restraining order to keep him away from the Blakes. As the gavel fell, Charles let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Amara's eyes filled with tears as she hugged him tightly. "It's over," she whispered. "Not yet," Charles replied, his voice steady. "But it's a start." The weeks following the verdict brought change to Rosewood Ridge. The neighborhood held a meeting to discuss how to rebuild trust and move forward. Charles was invited to speak, standing in front of the same crowd that once gathered on his lawn in anger. "This neighborhood can be better," he said. "It's not just about what we stand against, but what we stand for. It's about creating a place where everyone feels safe and welcome." The room erupted in applause, with neighbors coming up to shake his hand. Even some who had previously stayed silent approached with heartfelt apologies. Outside, Malik filmed the gathering, his camera capturing the smiles and handshakes. "This feels different," he said to Amara. "Like they actually mean it." Amara nodded, watching as the twins played with a group of neighborhood kids. "It does. Maybe things really can change." One sunny afternoon, Lily and Emma appeared at the edge of the Blake's yard, holding a small sapling. "We wanted to give you this," Lily said, her voice shy but steady. "For your yard." Charles took the sapling, his heart swelling. "Thank you," he said. "It's perfect." The family gathered in the backyard, planting the tree together. Amara dug the hole while Charles held the sapling steady. Malik filmed the process, narrating the moment for posterity. As they finished, Amara stepped back, brushing the dirt from her hands. The sun filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the ground. "It's beautiful," she said softly. Charles wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "It's more than that. It's a symbol of what we've been through and what's ahead." Malik lowered his camera, smiling. "So, what's next?" Charles looked around at his family and then at the tree. "We move forward. Together." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the family sat on the porch, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. The laughter of the twins filled the air, mingling with the rustle of the new tree's leaves. For the first time in months, the Blakes felt at peace.